We're going to call this meeting of the Land Use and Planning Subcommittee.
Can't hear her. Pardon me, I couldn't hear you saying, that's why I'm moving up.
You can set, there's just us today.
I'm good.
So this is the Land Use and Planning Standing Committee of March 26th. And note that Senta is absent, so it's just Doug Miller and myself, and Pete Critelli, and Rod Bastian. Did you have a chance to look over those minutes?
I did.
Everything look okay?
Sure did.
I say sure did too, so I guess, you know, it's really easy when you only have three to deal with the minutes. So the minutes are good. And the first thing is this resolution 3645 with the Yellowstone Wildlife Sanctuary. The resolution 3459 is up for action tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And they did change the verbiage a little bit on us,
Okay.
but not too bad. A resolution of intent to obtain preliminary approval to formalize Yellowstone Wildlife Sanctuary's designated borders to conform to historical uses. So we didn't have that horrible word that was in there.
So I can live with this
Version, right?
I think I have the most recent. So we're good there. No issues with that resolution. Yeah, we have lost the word encroachment. Yellowstone Wildlife Sanctuary did not like that it was a resolution of intent to obtain preliminary approval to proceed with further evaluation of a land exchange to resolve an encroachment on city land.
So they wanted that stricken?
They didn't want that word encroachment because the city had allowed them to do that, to use that land, so the name has changed.
The discrepancy or what?
No, it was just easier to conform to the historical uses, and so that will be on the agenda tonight. So, how come oh, that's old. Okay. So that is good. The event policy, you know, we haven't even seen this event policy. I don't know what to do with that at all. I did pull out the use of city-owned land permit, and there's only two of them. One of them is for small groups and one for large groups. And they look identical to me, except for the prices on there. You would think that there would just be one.
Wasn't there something about, we had to get the word event in there as opposed to regular or a general permit, I think?
Well, I'm wondering if they want us to have use of city-owned land, which is not necessarily an event.
Right.
So I'm guessing they want use of city-owned land. One's for an event and one is for a private party, but that's what this, the small one says, use of city-owned land permit for private events of less than 75 participants.
Yeah. I don't think we had any problem with that.
Well, that's my question is, what was the problem that we're trying to solve?
I think it was just wordsmithing.
Well, that's something we're gonna need a little more guidance on, I'm guessing, because that makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Okay.
So I just pulled these off of the website. I recycle.
Good.
There was another whole side that was good. We can,
I can see it in the fact sheet.
yeah.
I think it was just wordsmithing. We needed to revise the form to include that terminology event. I think that's the only thing I can remember from last week.
I think it was something that the mayor brought up to us. Dates and hours, impacts, noise, trash, restrooms. And I think part of the deal is sometimes an event costs the city money.
Mm-hmm.
Like with the Harley, it costs the city the amount
Right.
of that. Because these, from what I can see, are identical. They're identical. So use of city-owned land would be parks, correct?
Correct.
Maybe the mayor can solve this for us.
I'm being paid, what can I help with?
We've had on here the event policy. We have the 2 city-owned land permits, one for small, one for larger than 75. What's the problem that we should have an event permit?
So, interestingly enough, there's a conversation going on amongst the mayor's discussion group last night. The last time I visited, it was about 3 or 4 o'clock this morning. I see that there has been a couple of responses. But the problem so we don't really have an event policy. We have a land use policy.
Right.
So the problem that I see with the land use policy is when the city wants to recoup expenses,
Right.
additional expenses tied to an event. So the easiest example to use is the Beartooth Rally.
Right.
The problem is that their land use permit is for a camping spot on the outskirts of town, and they provide 40 of their own security, they provide their own trash, they provide their own restrooms. There is zero cost to the city for them to use that land for camping. Intermittently, in the past, they have gone to certain events, whether it be that or whether it be Charlie's bar to do a dance, and said, you need to write us a $5,000 check or a $5,000 donation because we have to have extra police in town because of your event or because you're bringing people into town. And the problem is there's nothing that really qualifies that. So if we had something that said, if you're going to bring 5,000 people to town, we need to pay for 2 extra officers. If there's alcohol involved, it's 4 extra officers, or some sort of a form, kind of like our resort tax form, that talks about that. But the problem we have right now is it's a very arbitrary, your event, we think we're going to need more police because you're having camping. And how do we tell people, and the input I got from council at the first of the year when this came up was, you're right, we can't do that, and it has been very arbitrary, and that just spells the potential to get sued. So we need something that's consistent. And so to me, when I've talked to my neighbor who manages events such as the Macy's Day Parade, the New York Ball Drop, he's had a thing or two to do with events. What they do is they say you have an event policy as opposed to a land use policy, and one line on the event policy is there any use of city land on it? Then this is what it's going to cost. The other thing that they do is if the city is a co-sponsor of the event, which gets us a little bit more say and a seat at the table of discussion, then there isn't a charge for those additional services. That's what we do as a city. The business of Red Lodge, to an extent, or certainly our resort tax, is that we have events and that brings people, and that costs money, and we make resort tax more than we do from property tax.
So should we just have an event policy, period? Is there going to be use of city-owned land, and then that would go into one of these?
Or does it really even need all that information to do that? And that's what's the ask has been to council is to reevaluate that. So like theoretically, 4th of July, I started to say this earlier and didn't finish the thought, was theoretically, the Home of Champions Rodeo Parade is co-sponsored by the city. Now, that's verbal tradition. I don't know that anybody has found that paperwork as of yet. But if it is co-sponsored by the city, and that's therefore the city provides bathrooms, the whole issue is twofold. One, if we want to recoup expenses, we better be consistent, and it better tie to the thing we're giving up a permit to. You can't say, I need 2 more officers patrolling downtown because you have 150 or 300 people or whatever camping up there. There's no direct correlation there.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is, do we want to have a say or control over St. Patty's Day that came in on, they just went from Merv's Place down to or if we have marchers that want to march down the street, that's protected First Amendment speech, but it's very, very common that cities have some sort of a protest permit, or in fact, you've got 2 people in here that probably have fantastic input on, if you're going to have a parade, if you're going to have a march, if you're going to have is it just wild, wild west, anybody does what they want? We saw that be an issue several years back when we had the Black Lives Matter march that was marching back and forth until they could stir up a stir at the thing. And right now, we don't have any sort of a process that does that.
But they were on the sidewalks, so there was no control from the city.
You can, and that would be, can we do it? So interestingly enough, our policy that we have with DOT right now is they do from curb to curb and leave the rest to us. So even though it's theirs, we have an MOU in place with them that they have requested that we revisit, because we've started to talk to them about sidewalks and what do we need to do to fix the sidewalks and do some things as well. So we are revisiting that conversation. But what they have always done in the past, like when we closed down the street for Christmas Stroll, the reality is that's not our street. That's a state resource, but the state basically says, if the city's okay with it, we're on board with it. But the reality is, that's an event. Does that require additional police? Does that require that we have restrooms out? It seems to me, after watching the land use policy change 3 or 4 or 5 times over the course of my watching and observing it, that maybe we're approaching it from the wrong direction, and that what we're really not talking about is a land use property. We're talking about an event policy that, is there city land involved, and write a check is like one line that's also in the information. How many people are expected? The biggest reason you have an event policy, and we could go out and look at what the county is so that we can notify ambulance, fire, police, and we can make them aware of it. If there's a check that's made, I think that the Rodeo Association does play the county when they use grounds up there, the county grounds, but don't quote me on that. But it's just what we've tried, and and particularly as you look at some of these events, they feel like they're really targeted, like there was a specific audience.
Oh,
and
we know that there's a problem.
And that's a problem. And so to my thinking is if we have an event policy, and so like I said, and there's a whole conversation going on in the mayor's threads right now, because there's 2 or 3 people that are looking at event policies, and it's like, oh, how convenient, we're having the same conversation. And I haven't read all those responses yet, because I've just seen them within the last half hour.
So if we just had a plain old event policy, that would kind of get rid of these and incorporate the land use into the event.
It has the potential to do so. So ultimately, council's job is to determine what we have and what it looks like, and then it is staff and the mayor's job to enforce that. My question is, my request, it just needs to be something that can be enforceable. It can't have arbitrary stuff built into it, because we've seen how that gets arbitrarily applied, which is frustrating for residents and potentially costly for the city.
Well, it's wrong.
Is it arbitrary in there, the way it's written now?
It is because, well, so look in there and tell me which event I'm gonna charge for recuperation of expenses. It just says we can charge recuperation of expenses. But again, recuperation of expenses for what? To me, it has to do with recouping expenses of somebody using that field to camp in.
Yeah,
The
because
city,
city-owned
the city, but the city doesn't incur any actual expenses to do that. And so this fits really well into your wheelhouse. Show me the actual expenses.
Well, it just seems, you mentioned the word arbitrary. I'm not sure you can write a policy that's gonna cover everything. Maybe these other mayors can come up with some ideas, but, you know, you got city involved, not city involved. Using city land, not using city land. You have cops, you don't have, I mean, it just seems like writing a policy to cover everything would just go on and on and on.
Doug, if this job were easy, anybody could do it.
All right, so getting back to the question then, is this a good enough base that we can take this and modify it for events?
Should we make a stab at it?
I think you guys should make a stab, and I'm happy to relay on the information that I hear. Because like I said, I literally sent that email at 3:00 this morning, and so I've gotten, but somebody else had kind of initiated the thread, and that's when I saw it.
So did we have an event that caused this to become an issue?
I think Beartooth Rally is probably the #1 event that's there.
Last year, the mayor required, the Beartooth Rally to pay for 2 policemen for the 4 days.
I believe it was actually
It
$5,000,
was $5,000.
and they're paying police a lot more than I thought they were.
But
That
all
was
they
it.
needed for that rally was a land use permit for camping. And they have a group that takes care of everything. So it didn't cost the city a dime for that, or police, or anything else.
So what is our
Now,
point of
we
view?
we may have had police downtown that were a necessity because somebody hosted an event or a gathering.
Yeah,
But how do you tie that to your camping outside of downtown?
I don't know that you can.
See, and I, even last year, when Heather was gonna go ahead and pay that 5,000, I told her, are you crazy? Why would you do that? Why would you,
But-
there's nothing
but-
here that requires.
But it has been done 2 or 3 years, and I'll be honest, it feels like paying tribute. It feels like a bad TV episode with a bad, that doesn't end well for somebody, the way we do it. It's been a shakedown by the city.
Yeah,
And unless you have a policy that said, this is why and this is how,
Wait a
and
minute,
here's how we justify
Did
it,
the city shake somebody down?
that's a matter of opinion. I would if we did it to one person and one person only last year, said, we're only gonna approve this if you write us a check for $5,000, is that a shakedown?
well, here's the thing, we don't, well, it's city, whatever, sponsored, the 4th of July brings in hordes of people,
Mm-hmm.
just like the rally does.
Okay.
But we don't require ever any compensation at all.
So the wording we have says we are allowed to recoup expenses.
Okay.
That's the only thing
Allowed.
that's in there, is a sentence, is the city may recuperate expenses.
Allowed, but doesn't say we have
Look-
to.
Yeah, and right now, the direction from council is don't enforce that, and so we haven't.
Okay.
And I'm okay with that.
I just wonder if we're trying to make something out of nothing here.
No, I think that this does need to be, I agree, that the event, we don't have a policy for event. We only had a policy for them camping.
So are you gonna write a policy that addresses that particular issue?
I think that we should have an event policy, like how many people do you estimate will be there? What use of city-owned land might be involved in the
Okay,
length of time?
and are we gonna charge them?
If in fact it's going to cause the city expenses, yeah.
But
And-
just like you mentioned, everybody comes to town for 4th of July, it brings a whole lot of people in here. We don't charge anybody for that. And these people bring a lot of money into town.
That
And
they
so
do.
now you get into either it's the business of the city, or you just say, and I don't think we start from scratch. I think because a lot of it is parades, speeches, marches. There was a lot of clamoring when there was the parade a few years back for a political candidate that was, stop them for stopping up traffic or sort of a thing. But the reality is, other cities have stuff like that. So to me, I would say, let's start by looking at cities, large, big, small, and see if they have something. Because what I don't think we want to do is just have, and another example. So if you go back, there's been like, abortion, anti-abortion or pro-life protesting that set up on a corner in town. And they're right there in Pride Park, and they come out on a Saturday and they sit there blocking the thoroughfare for 2 or 3 hours. That's a First Amendment right. That doesn't mean we can't regulate it to make sure it minimally impacts. And like I said, you've got 2 police officers in there. But I want to back up a little bit, because the shakedown, I think, is dramatic, right? But the fact is, if we say you have to do this or we're not going to give you a permit, and there's not real solid logic behind that, that's scary.
Well, I just hate upsetting the apple cart. These people haven't caused any problem, and we pissed them off last year by saying you gotta pay, and was that necessary? And you said no.
Well,
So why, I'm just not quite sure.
And this year, we haven't.
we've been really lucky because we've had some, motorcycle groups in here that weren't the lawyers and doctors,
Right?
you know, and I think the reason why we haven't had any issues is because we have a strong police presence. When you go to the rally, you'll
Okay.
find
That's fine,
law
that's good.
enforcement from all over.
Yeah.
We talked today, about public safety, about asking the resort tax to cover police overtime specifically during our tourism season. So this might be a double dip.
Well,
If in fact
and
the
to me,
resort
there's a valid now, it's the voters who have to change that.
We know that.
But to say, can we use some of the resort tax to cover the additional expense that we incur because they're all in town? That makes all the,
Because it's a tourism town. it's a
but I
resort.
don't want to discourage people from having events. Now, that's Dave. I don't think we want to discourage people from having events. Historically, we have seen people that says, well, I like event X, but I don't like event Y.
And that's
To me,
fine.
events are events, and they bring money into this town.
I think that's what I'm focusing on. And, if the mayor, in my opinion, went online and tried to charge people, she didn't do that based on any policy.
Well, we are allowed to recoup expenses. What we didn't have happen is we don't have a mechanism in there that says you have to provide a basis for why you came up with the number you came up with.
Right.
That's what's
But when
missing.
we talk about recoup expenses, again, people that come to town for the 4th of July, we don't recoup expenses.
And we close off
We-
streets and, you
Right,
know,
so it just seems,
reroute traffic.
just don't know if
I-
it's time well spent.
It's just, we need consistency,
We don't have it.
not in my observation.
Is there an incident that happened where we didn't?
4th of July, we didn't do anything to the Home of Champions Rodeo. You're bringing a bunch of people to town, write us a check. Fairtooth Rally, you're bringing a bunch of people to town, you have to write us a check.
But
That was last year.
We haven't done it before.
We did it last year.
We did.
But you just said, you told them don't pay it.
No, they did.
She did it anyway.
They had 2 choices, write a check or write in a check to an attorney.
They were denying her the land use permit if she didn't pay $5,000 for extra police. That was not attached to the land use at all, because that was already taken care of, all that security. So that's what we're talking about. So that's what has happened, and we have to either justify that in the future or not. And maybe we can start off by changing changing this to an event policy that may or may not use city-owned land.
That was just an idea, and it was triggered from learning about the events of last year, and that it came up this year again when Charlie put in his thing, and I asked council, what do you want me to do with this? because it's not applied consistently. I'm only aware of one event where it's actually been applied to, and that feels very targeted, very capricious, and if I'm gonna be the one responsible for enforcing it, I remember when Peter Italiano was here, and there was, we were talking about parking or ordinance this or that or the other. What his guidance was, which I thought made all the sense in the world, is the policy needs to be such that staff looks at it and says, I can apply it based on the rules. Building code is a fantastic example of that. I wanna come and build a house. I can look at it and say, is this within the lines or is this outside of the lines? And then what do I have to do if it's outside of the lines? But now, I'm not saying our event policy has to be as big as our building policy, which is double the size of Phoenix, Arizona, which makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
But the idea is, staff's job is to apply the rules that have been set out by council.
Evenly. Ron?
I think when you're talking about the cost of an event, even the Beartooth Rally, the majority of the things that happen in town, downtown, are not necessarily of their making.
Yeah, it is within the law to ride a motorcycle into town.
You have street dances, you know, one or two that are sponsored by businesses that are not related to the Beartooth Rally. But yet, those street dances create the issues, the alcohol creates the issues that the police are involved in. And not necessarily even, you know, people come to town and they come to town for that particular event or a party.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a party at any one particular location sponsored by one business or one entity. So charging the Beartooth Rally for the extra police officers when, for the most part, when all that activity's going on, they're closed. Their event isn't technically happening.
And according to the chief of police and past chiefs of police, it actually takes less police because we're concentrating everybody up out of town and having that event up there. Now, Chief Schrock did say on Charlie's, they have their own security that they provide. But guess what? Somebody gets drunk and they walk outside of those boundaries and they walk down the street.
And cause a problem.
Now that's where there is a potential and an
So
event.
here-
Well, I'm not sure an event policy would change that.
If we go back to an event policy, wouldn't that also include everything happening for that event? Not only the use of the land up at the rodeo grounds, but also the use of shutting off the streets for a dance. I mean, that would
So
be
is
the event.
Charlie's Dance part of Beartooth Rally event, or is it really 3 events that are happening in town on the same weekend?
And that's the thing,
It's three separate
it's,
events.
right now, there are 3 separate events, but it's still one event. It's
Um,
one
No,
event.
I like it's
piggybacking-
3.
They're
They're
piggybacking
piggybacking.
off of the base of
The
that,
rally, yeah.
but it's, most of the problems are not their doing.
Yeah.
You know, it's the atmosphere of the people that come to town, because most of their events happen outside of the city limits, right?
Yeah,
And they work hard to
The
do
rally,
that.
you know, the event on the Sunday is at the rodeo grounds outside of the city
it's
limits.
in the county.
The poker runs on the highways outside of the city limits. The only thing they really do in the city limits is they sell T-shirts and they register riders for the events, whether it's a poker run or the rodeo, but none of those events happen in the city limits.
Yeah,
So where it comes from, you know, it draws people together for a common interest, which would be the motorcycles. But it's not necessarily one entity that's causing the need for additional resources. That's the challenge. Car show. People,
that's drunks.
well, it's a different mindset. They don't come
Group.
for the party, they come to observe,
To show off their cars.
show off their cars, people come to look at their cars, and it packs Main Street.
And we, shut
But-
off one street, maybe, well, we shut off a couple.
Yeah, as it expanded, it shut off more side streets to allow for more cars to park,
Right.
but The event is parking cars. And it has nothing to do with who's eating in the restaurants or going to the bars or shopping in the shops, but it increases all of that activity for the benefit of the city. So the challenge is, who do you pin the additional activities onto?
Or do you just absorb it because we're Red Lodge and that's what we do and that's the cost of doing business?
Okay,
And that's why I go back to resort tax use.
hear me out here. I think the application should have a box check event, use of city-owned land, or both.
Right.
When I was on the events committee, that goes to show you how long this has been going on, we were gonna send it around to the police department and public works department for them to tell us, the council, what extra resources they needed. And if the public works needed a man or woman to be out here at 5:30 cleaning out those trash cans, then we paid extra hours. Same with their extra law enforcement.
And we still do that. They have shifted it to the mayor now makes those decisions.
Okay.
So it goes out to all the
But
departments.
make no mistake, if you have 150 people at that rodeo area, they're gonna be in town. And that should not be discounted that way, because those people are here to party and they're coming downtown.
Agree.
But I think the application should have either one or the other or both. Because if it's, the city is participating, then the charges could be reduced. Not citation charges, but the monetary charges.
Like I said, if we're a co-sponsor in the
That's right.
event and participating in it.
So it doesn't have to be two applications, it can be just have a box to check.
And one box, is the city a co-sponsor, which bing, gets you out of it. We'll absorb the fee.
Well, it gets out of, it, the city's participating, but I don't necessarily think the city has to foot the whole bill. But it can be a combination of city land, use land, event, or city participation, or both. And when you have one application.
And where the
I agree
problem,
with the
and
one.
where the problem comes from right now is a big event comes to town, we rake in an extra $50,000 or $100,000 worth of resort tax. But the problem is, we have to pay the extra cops out of general fund, which is not resort tax. So you can argue we're making money on the event, so it really isn't costing us anything. But the problem is, there's no way to say that money is used to directly pay the police just because the accounting, just the bars. And that's kind of the enterprise fund versus general fund versus,
Well, that's why we're going in that
Revenue.
direction, to try to get some of the police department manpower to cover. It's crazy that the resort tax wouldn't cover.
and in my 2 cents, that solves our, now, that still doesn't mean we just go wild, wild west.
No.
But to me, that gets rid of the, we use the term shakedown for the dramatic effect of it, but it's like, yeah, you spend a couple $1,000s, but we made an extra 20 or 30, we're money ahead.
When I was working, we did patrol up there, both as an officer and a deputy. We only made sure that things were not out of hand and that their security was communicating with us and present. And we very rarely had to get out of our cars.
Yeah, I've
But we
heard,
still went up there.
You make, yeah, and I think you have an awareness and a presence, but it wasn't something that required extra staff to handle.
Well, there was, yes, there was. We brought in extra reserves,
Well, we have highway patrol that comes in, I know when the Hells Angels came.
but we just had a presence up there, and if the things were gonna get exacerbated, they would give us a thumbs up and we would stop.
Yeah.
Because they can only go so far as private security.
I'd be more afraid of them than I would of you, but I think they police their own because they understand the value and the need to have that event. And part of what I think we need to do as a resort community is we need to make those people feel welcome.
absolutely.
And there has been a drop the last couple of years. Is that just because folks are aging out because it's the doctors and lawyers? How much of that is, I don't want to go there anymore because they don't feel welcome, which, by the way, was stated as part of the intent? I don't agree with it, but
But being up there lets people know that marked cars and lets people know that they should not step out of bounds, because those security guards don't have arrest powers,
Yeah.
and that's why the cars should go through there.
It's just that you're backing up their security.
That's
It's
right.
like, you have their security, oh, well, you know, we're just rent a cop, no big deal. But when you guys drive through, this is saying, but they have backup.
And so the last thing, and then I've got to go, I apologize, because I do want to be back for, the meeting is 15 minutes, so that's going to be problematic. Is, to me, we're not just trying to solve this problem for right now, because I don't anticipate we're going to have a problem now, or we're going to have a problem next year. But I'd love to see if we can take a stab that resolves this a little bit more. I know about the rest of you. The reason I took this job was not for the great pay, not for the great hours. It's because I plan on retiring here, and I want it to be someplace I can live out my years and not go crazy in. And so that's part of what we're doing, is we're trying to make sure that our problems are fixed long-term. That's the conversation about the park. How do we fix that so that problem doesn't come up again?
Yeah.
And
Thank you, Dave.
anything else?
Well, the next one is our MOU versus a lease. And I did find your books.
I saw you in looking through the books.
Unfortunately, the books that have the MOUs and the leases also have every contract.
Mhm.
So there's not a book for MOUs and a book for leases, so that I could easily
But you
do
did
it.
get the index printed out.
I did get the index. It went back to 1921. 1921. And that was the Consolidated Mausoleum Company, 1921. So nothing gets dated out. And so that even the MOUs are not all gonna be,
Will you do me a favor, since I know they pulled that for you, they had to pull multiple documents to do that because there's one for each book. Will you make sure we scan that and provide that as just an index? We ought to have that right on the top in a very thin book that says, here's the whole thing, so you know which book to grab.
okay, I can do that.
Thank you for being here.
So we do have a problem with the MOU versus a lease. And I pulled the the difference between agreement and memorandum of understanding, as they say that, basically there's money involved, which isn't necessarily. This all came up on a couple of problems. One is there is city-owned land at the top of, well, I guess that's East Bench Road overlooking the sewer ponds. In 2019, Jim Bushnell and Eric Boderoff leased that land for cows. And it was a lease agreement because they paid, okay? But there doesn't seem to, they're still up there, the cows are still up there, and this was 4 years ago. So should leases have an automatic, it's like, when does this stop? Termination. It says that you may terminate this lease at any time by mutual agreement with 30 days notice. So I guess they just keep on,
Well, does it state running in perpetuity, or does it have a closure date?
it only has a termination date. That's
What-
all it says. It says termination. It doesn't, it's
doesn't
not a
give a
regular
date.
lease. like
Well,
we
any future
expect.
one should have a termination date or in perpetuity,
Yeah.
or an option clause.
Well, it says the term is from, May 1st, 2019 to 31st day of October, 2019. That's a term, okay? And then it has termination, which I assume would be within that period, but they're still running cows up there. I don't know if they're collecting money or what the deal is.
Well, and that's an example to correct the problem by putting a termination date, in perpetuity, or option to renew.
Yeah, there has to be something, so
Right.
this is pitiful, to say the least, because it's not. There's, I did pull the MOU for Lions Club, only because it was easy to get my hands on. I also have the lease agreement, for Silver Strike, which is much better written than the one for the other. This kind of started because of the observatory. So they built a permanent building on city-owned land. So an MOU that can be terminated with a 30-day notice leaves the city with that building and that maintenance of that building and operation of that observatory, which was never the intent at all. And so should that have been a lease instead of an MOU?
Well, if that's rhetorical, but if it's a question, it should have been a lease.
And that's where I'm trying to have a definite definition of MOU versus a lease.
Well, understanding is very ambiguous.
That-
Lease has structure.
Yeah, a memorandum of understanding. And I'm still, even with all these event things, unsure, like with Rotary Park, I've been involved with that and seen the MOU come up for every 5 years. We, have the option to renew the MOU. So the Rotary Club has installed, benches and tables and barbecues, half of which are in the creek somewhere. But, and that was Rotary's responsibility to maintain that park. It's to maintain the park, but we did build on that too. I was told, and this is probably not true, that there was a family group that wanted to use the park exclusively, because it was a big family group. And the city told them to check with Rotary. So that's use of city-owned land, and I don't think the MOU overrides that.
Well, if you had a lease, you could have a sublease yeah.
But we don't have a lease, we have an MOU.
But in the future, you should perhaps go to the council and say, we need to stop these MOUs and go to leases.
I honestly am starting to think that way, because we're talking about creating Rodeo Park. And if we create Rotary Park, then they're talking that would be a lease, an MOU. Who has the right to say you can use this land?
Well, the council needs to just decide it, go with leases, have it in perpetuity, expiration dates, or, renewed.
And the lease can be for money or not money. It doesn't,
Just for due consideration.
yeah.
Yeah, we need to take a more business approach, the council does.
Yeah,
And go with black and white leases.
these MOUs are problematic.
Well, the word understanding is problematic.
Yeah.
Your most used park is Lions Park.
Uh-huh.
What's the,
It's an MOU.
it's an MOU, but the city grants permission
Use
to
of
use. So why wouldn't they grant permission to use at Rotary Park?
Well, that's why I wondered why they sent it to us to grant use of that, and it's
Who's
really
they?
foggy. The city. All I know is that the group called the city to use Rotary Park, and they said you have to check with Rotary.
Well, that may be, it was an incorrect referral.
It might have been an incorrect
Yeah.
referral, because Lions Park, you have to pull a request for use of city-owned land.
Yeah.
If it were a lease, would then,
Depends on what the city does the city want to maintain control of that property? Or do they want to relinquish the control and let another organization control the
control
property?
that property. I think
But
control is,
and Rod's right, but
control is the word.
if the Lions were leasing that, there could be a clause in there that it's predicated on cancellation by either party with 6 months' notice.
Right,
Yeah.
Not
I mean,
30
it has
days.
to be carefully written,
yeah.
but
Yeah.
it has to have escape clauses and some kind of definitive end or extension.
And I honestly think that we need one book that has the leases in it that are active. I don't care if they divide it up into active leases and inactive leases.
Well, you could take
Or-
the MOUs and then slowly transfer them to leases.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that way you get rid of the MOUs. But I wouldn't make a big project out of it, I would try to make the transition as those MOUs come to maturity.
If they did have a mature date. This just says that an MOU between the city and Lions Club was executed April 1993 and subsequently updated April 26, 2016. So what does that mean? But,
So the parties could be notified that you're changing the agreement to a lease, and if there's an objection to that, we'll have them come forward. But the lease is gonna tighten things up so that there's not a bunch of loose strings, in my opinion.
Totally agree.
yeah, and,
I
No.
guess that when you talk about a lease, that gives control to an entity over city-owned property, is that kind of where we're headed? And at that point, then who becomes responsible for maintenance, mowing the grass, repairing and
And
supplying?
that could be put in the lease.
So I guess that's the difference between an MOU
Yeah,
versus a lease, as to who becomes a responsible party for,
the lessee,
you know, because when you transfer control of a property with a lease, like a rental,
Yeah.
you no longer have control.
except for any law enforcement. No, law enforcement can enter that property.
yeah,
Right. But as far as the day-to-day activities upon that property,
Well, it could be a double net or triple net lease that the lessee agrees to pay the landscaping, sanitation, or the lessee cannot agree to it,
Right.
and the city would agree to it. But it has to be defined, in my opinion.
we're just really sloppy on the
Well, but-
MOUs and leases and.
And unslop it.
Yeah, well, if the difficulty is going to be, to me, it's one thing if it's just a park with no structures. Once you put a structure on it, first off, for instance, Silver Strike, okay, they have a 25-year lease, and they have to pay property tax on the building. And they pay the property tax on the building, even though it's city-owned land. And because they're leasing it, so they have control of it.
But
Yeah, when, Ruby wanted to put in a coffee kiosk in there, the city had to approve that.
No. Each situation needs to be dealt with individually to the benefit of both parties. And if they need to be rewritten, they can't be a blanket. Each one has to be dealt with. Because there are special, circumstances, like the bowling alley. And it's not an insurpassable project. It's just gonna take time at one location after another.
Yeah, because you've got the All Nations Garden Club,
Yeah.
you know? So we've got that. I mean, there's a lot.
you may have to determine what the function of an MOU is versus the function of a lease.
And I
And then
think,
determine if you need both or you only need one. And then from there, you can move on to cleaning it up.
so we could conceivably have a lease and still have the city approve what they're doing on the lease.
It would have to be so stated.
Well, that's what we're doing with Lions, you know? When they want to have Shakespeare in the Park, the city has to grant approval of that.
That's an event, though.
Do they get permission from the Lions?
I hope so.
Because once you lease it to an entity, then they have control over the events that would happen on the property.
Well, you put the specifics in the lease, you have to agree with them, they don't have carte blanche.
Yeah.
That has to be
So that both
specified.
sides understand.
Yeah.
And it's just like when we're talking about the rodeo park, I think what the mayor was saying was that the rodeo, group would be the ones that would say, yes, this is a good, event, but now you have to go to the city to get an event, permit for it. Because then they're going to arrange, like, they said, oh, this isn't gonna work for us because we've already got an event going there. So they have control of that. So let's say somebody, goes to the rodeo ground, or to the rodeo and says, we wanna use all of that parking there for, camping. And they said, well, you can't because, you know, we've got the Harley rallies already using that. So they would have some control
That
of
just goes back to
approving it.
the language of the rodeo park.
Lease,
Yes.
probably lease, which means that they approve it first and then it goes to the city.
So that language has to be specific, as that they have control of that, if that is in fact geographically part of their park.
Yeah, so we're gonna need to.
The challenge with the rodeo, the proposed rodeo park is, the rodeo only needs it one, maybe 2 times a year.
Yeah, one of them's Harley.
Well,
But, you know, they've also had concerts
the
up there.
rodeo association doesn't sponsor the Harley rodeo.
No,
They just
They-
allow,
they rent it to them or
right,
rent the, yeah.
as a, and I don't know how it all works, but
Hi, Chelsea.
Hi, sorry, I know, I'm like,
Okay. So that's something to put in our,
Like you said, we need to gradually start and take one at a time, take the most significant at a time, and make sure that there's a lease as opposed to an MOU, and make sure that the language in the lease is beneficial to both parties. MOUs, there's no reason we shouldn't have, include dates, termination dates on that.
I think so, I think so too. I think they're,
If we agree MOUs, the appropriate thing, then we make sure it fits, that's including dates.
I mean, it's okay to have a termination clause in there in case something happens, the rodeo club disbands and they're in the middle. There's nothing wrong with the termination date, but it does need to have a start and finish.
Someone needs to identify all of them and slowly make the transition.
The
If it takes 3 years, it takes 3
The
years.
identifying was hard when I got all
Yeah.
these pages, because there were some old ones, they're not, yeah. I don't get I thought, when he told me there was a book that had
But it's not something
MOUs,
that's gonna be done in 6 months.
it's like, oh, no. You know, this even has the mausoleum, contract for you.
do it.
Okay, do we have anything else from the audience you guys want to address at this point? No?
No.
Well, then I am going to go ahead and call it done.
Okay,
Thank you for coming.
yes.
Appreciate the input. I know we're not finalizing anything, but we are
I think you've made some good
tossing it
progress here
around.
today.
You know, there are things going on that we need to think out before we get bit in the bottom.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to
Is there another one now?